We are not making any progress here, and I'm hoping that tomorrow I can come back and maintain my argument.
On Starspill USA, the silence inside the courtroom was so suffocating that it felt less like a pause in proceedings and more like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Polished oak gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, every creak of the wooden benches echoing like thunderclaps in the tense air. Every cough or shuffle magnified into a distraction that sent heads turning. Because this wasn't just another trial. This was the public dismantling of a man who once ruled his household like a king, and the gavel that slammed down across the bench reverberated through the room with a force that silenced even the whisperers in the back rows. A gavel stroke that announced not just order, but the collapse of an empire, because in that instant, the world of Kody Brown, once untouchable patriarch, once star of a TLC empire, once the self-styled head of Sister Wives, began to crumble in real time before cameras, fans, his wives, and his children. And what came next would turn a family scandal into a generational catastrophe. The kind of downfall that would be replayed on evening news, whispered about in living rooms, and dissected by fans online for years to come. But in that moment, it wasn't commentary or gossip. It was raw, painful reality, with reporters leaning forward at the press bench, pens poised mid-air like daggers ready to stab the page. Cameras flashing, rapid-fire bursts that froze every twitch of Kody's face into eternal frames. While the judge, a severe woman with sharp glasses balanced on her nose, fixed her cold gaze on Kody Brown and announced words no one expected to hear in the middle of his own trial, a warrant for his arrest. Words so surreal, so unprecedented, that the sound of gasps rippled through the benches like an earthquake rolling through the ground, Christine's hand flying to her mouth in pure disbelief. Janelle's carefully stacked papers, shaking violently in her grip as her composure cracked for the first time. And even Meri, the quiet one, the wife who had so often withdrawn behind silence and folded arms, sat frozen in wide-eyed shock, her lips parting as if to form words but none arriving. While across the aisle Robin dissolved into sobs, mascara streaking down her cheeks in black rivers. Her whispered prayers, please God, I think we said, no, drowned out by the metallic snap of handcuffs, locking around Kody's wrists. A sound so sharp and final that it sliced through the courtroom air like a gunshot. A sound that announced to the world that the man who had once strutted across television screens as a confident patriarch was now reduced to a defendant shackled like a criminal in front of his wives, his children, and the cameras he once controlled. And though that moment itself should have been the climax, the cruel irony was that it was only the beginning. Because what came next was worse, much worse. A descent into revelations so dark and so damning that even seasoned reporters found themselves shaken. And even the wives, who thought they had already endured the worst, would discover that the bottom had not yet been reached. Because as Kody sat shackled at the defense table, his swagger gone, his jaw clenched but trembling, his once bright blonde hair now limp under the fluorescent glow, his tie pulled tight around a throat that strained with suppressed panic. The bailiff leaned toward the judge and whispered words so devastating that her face hardened instantly, the calm mask she had worn all morning cracking into an expression of cold, glacial determination, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing behind the lenses of her glasses, and with a slow, deliberate nod, she turned her gaze back to Kody, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade. This court has been notified of further evidence. Evidence contained in a sealed file. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one had yet seen, and the reaction was instantaneous. Gasps from the benches, murmurs rising and falling like waves, spectators shifting in their seats with nervous anticipation, reporters scribbling so fast their pens nearly tore the paper. Christine and Janelle exchanging a look of dread that told the world they feared what might come next. Because sealed files were never good. Sealed files meant secrets buried deep. Secrets too dangerous to air unless forced by necessity. And Robin's sobs broke into panicked words, her body trembling, her voice hoarse as she cried out, "Please, not that. Please, it has nothing to do with this. It's personal. Please don't open it." But the judge's hand was already on the file, her knuckles white against the thick folder as she pulled it across the bench. The room growing so silent that even the scratching of pens ceased. And when she cracked it open with a stiff flip, the sound of paper on paper was like a thunderclap, a sound that made Cody's head snap up in horror, his eyes darting from the judge to the folder. Wide, frantic pleading, his lips forming words. It came out in desperate fragments. "Not that file. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It's not part of this case." But his protests fell dead in the air as the judge ignored him, her voice steady, deliberate, heavy with the weight of revelation as she declared, "This file contains material that this court cannot ignore." And then, like pulling daggers one by one from a sheath, the clerk began to read the contents aloud, exposing not only financial misconduct but outright identity theft, bank accounts opened in Christine and Janelle's names without their signatures, forged property transfers designed to strip them of their legal rights, transcripts of conversations between Cody and his financial advisors, where his own voice detailed strategies to keep the other wives powerless. Documents so damning that even the most cynical observers sat slack-jawed. Christine gasping aloud as the clerk recited her name on a fraudulent account. Janelle whispering that's identity fraud in a voice so shocked it sounded like she was speaking to herself. And then the words that broke the room open completely. "Keep the paper trail clean. Christine's too emotional. Janelle won't push back if she doesn't have proof. And Meri's loyalty is gone. I'll have nothing. Legally speaking, nothing." The reaction was nuclear. Christine cried out, her voice cracking, "You lied to us, Cody. You lied to our kids." Janelle slammed her fist against the table so hard the papers jumped, her fury breaking through years of calm restraint. Her composure disintegrating into raw, righteous rage, and even Meri, the wife who had endured the longest silence, finally found her voice, her words cutting colder than ice. "This was never love, Cody. This was power." Her voice reverberating in the stunned silence as though the entire room had been waiting for her to finally speak. And then, as if the daggers of the documents weren't enough, the clerk pressed play on a small recorder, and Cody's own voice crackled through the speaker, filling the chamber with a confession no spin doctor could erase. His voice deep, deliberate, devoid of remorse, as he said, "We don't need their signatures. If they question me, I'll guilt them until they give in. It always works. And if they don't, I still win." Words so venomous, so manipulative, so revealing of intent that gasps, sobs, and furious whispers erupted all at once. Christine rising to her feet, trembling but unflinching as she cried, "You used us. You destroyed the family we built," while Janelle's voice cut sharper than any attorney's argument. This wasn't survival. This was betrayal. And the judge's gavel thundered against the bench, her voice like a hammer, driving nails into a coffin. This court finds intent. Intent to deceive, intent to defraud, intent to manipulate. And in that instant, Cody slumped forward, his head buried in his hands, sweat dripping onto the table. The once mighty patriarch now reduced to a man unraveling before the world. His power stripped, his lies exposed, his empire collapsing in full view of cameras and spectators alike. And though Robin screamed through her tears, wailing, "He loves us. He did it for love." Her voice sounded hollow, desperate, already drowned out by the truth spilling from every page, every tape, every testimony. It's because what had begun as a trial over money had become something much greater. The public execution of a man's credibility, the death of a myth that had propped up a family for decades. And the hammer blow of the judge's final words struck the courtroom like thunder. This is not the end. The sealed file is only the beginning. More will come to light. And in that chilling proclamation, the courtroom froze, every heartbeat audible. Because the Brown family was no longer fighting for property or pride. They were watching the collapse of an empire of lies. And though the gavel echoed finality, everyone in the room understood that what they had just seen was not the conclusion of a scandal, but the opening of a Pandora's box that promised revelations darker than anyone was prepared to face.
And loyal person when it comes to a commitment. And so, she doesn't take that lightly.
Robin finally stood up from her chair, staggering a step forward. Her knees trembling under the unbearable weight of truth, her voice breaking as if it had to claw its way out through shards of glass. "Stop, Cody. Just stop. You call this survival? You ruined us. You ruined everything we had." Her sobs filled the courtroom like the echoes of a wounded animal, raw and painful, and for the first time since the saga began. She wasn't standing by his side. She was standing against him. That moment was like an earthquake. The courtroom no longer felt like a trial of spouses. It felt like a battlefield. On one side stood Cody, shackled in chains, yet still trying to summon the bravado of a fallen king. And on the other side stood not just Christine, Janelle, and Meri, but even Robin, the wife who had always been his fortress, now visibly crumbling under the unbearable truth. The judge's face was drawn with strain, her gavel echoing like thunder as she declared, "This court needs a recess." And with that, the air split apart. The wives spilled into the hallway, their cheeks streaked with tears, their bodies quaking under the gravity of what had just been revealed. Christine clutched Janelle's hand as though letting go would mean collapse. The two women stood shoulder to shoulder like survivors clinging to one another in the wreckage of a shipwreck. Meri stood slightly apart, her eyes lost in a distance. That wasn't just physical, it was the distance of decades of quiet suffering finally finding air. And Robin, the once fiercely loyal wife who would have defended Cody against the world, collapsed onto a hard wooden bench, mascara running in streaks down her face, rocking back and forth as she whispered the same words over and over again. Like a broken hymn. What have we done? What have we done? Inside the courtroom, Cody sat alone at the defendant's table, bailiffs flanking him like sentinels. His eyes were wet but defiant, his jaw set so tightly it trembled. He muttered, under his breath, whispers barely audible, "They'll come back. They always come back." But even he seemed to know this time was different. His empire was cracking, not just from the edges, but from the very core, and the sound of collapse was deafening in its silence. When recess ended, the judge returned, her posture sharp as steel, her eyes as cold as mountain ice. "This court will continue with the sealed file," she announced, her tone unforgiving. "There are mentions within it of undisclosed accounts and events that may meet the standard of criminal coercion." Cody's head shot up, his face pale, his voice desperate and ragged. "No," he shouted, his chains rattling violently. "That's not true. That file was sealed for a reason." His panic was not just fear. It was the sound of a man watching the last lock on his fortress being broken open. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench like a gunshot. "It will not remain sealed if it contains evidence of criminal behavior," she declared. "This court will find every truth, no matter how sinister." Christine's attorney leaned forward, his voice smooth but sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, then I move that the next batch of evidence be released immediately. If Mr. Brown has something more to hide, this family and this court deserve to hear it." The judge nodded, her expression grim. Motion granted. A collective gasp swept across the room like a gust of wind through a forest fire. Reporters jolted upright, their pens flying across notepads, cameras snapping furiously. The wives stiffened. Even Robin let out a low cry, her hands trembling in terror. As the clerk retrieved the envelope, each step echoed across the polished floor like the toll of a funeral bell. Cody slumped forward, his forehead crashing against the table, his chains clattering as he broke down into loud guttural sobs. For the first time, the once mighty patriarch wept like a child. His body racked with the sound of a man begging silently for mercy that would never come. The envelope itself looked ancient, corners frayed, thick with secrets long buried. The judge held it as though it weighed 1,000 pounds, pausing with a stillness so suffocating the entire courtroom froze. Then she ripped it open. Papers spilled across the bench like a flood of skeletons pouring out of a locked closet. Her eyes moved swiftly, darkening with each line. Her lips pressed into a razor-thin line until finally she looked up. Her voice was sharp, merciless. These reports cite payments, large transfers of money, from shared family accounts into accounts owned solely by Mr. Brown. Even worse, they include allegations that Mr. Brown forced one wife to sign legal documents. Under threats, the room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the sound of Christine's sharp intake of breath. Her face drained of color, her lips trembling violently. Janelle clutched the edge of the table so hard her knuckles blanched white. Meri pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes stretched wide in horror. Robin shook her head furiously, her face streaked with tears. No, not that. Please, not that. Cody leaped to his feet, his chains crashing against the wood, his voice hysterical. That's a lie. It's fabrication. I never forced anyone. He thrashed, desperate to claw back control, but the judge's gavel boomed. You will stay seated, Mr. Brown. Christine's voice broke the chaos. She stood, trembling like a reed in a storm, tears pouring unchecked. He did, she cried, her voice trembling but unshakable. He made me sign once years ago. I begged him to explain, but he yelled. He threatened to disinherit me, to leave me with nothing if I didn't comply. I signed because I was afraid of what would happen to me, to my children if I refused. The courtroom gasped in unison. Even reporters stopped mid-sentence, their pens frozen. Cody's face twisted with panic. Christine, no. He begged, leaning toward her, his chains rattling violently. You're remembering wrong. You're angry. That's not the truth. But Christine's voice was a hammer, each syllable smashing through years of silence. You silenced me, Cody. You silenced all of us. But you can't silence me anymore. Janelle rose next, her voice quaking with both fear and fury. He did it to me too. Different papers, different day. He intimidated me. Told me if I didn't sign, I'd ruin everything for the kids. He manipulated us. He used our own children as pawns. He told me it was for them, but it was always for him. The room exploded into pandemonium. Gasps, cries, whispers, the very sound of an empire collapsing. Robin buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I begged him not to. I begged him. Her wail pierced the room like glass shattering. For the first time, everyone realized Robin wasn't denying the accusations. She was affirming them. The last bastion of his defense had finally fractured. The judge's gavel thundered, her voice searing through the chaos. This court will have order. But order was impossible. Each wife's testimony was another nail in Cody's coffin, and now even Robin's loyalty was reduced to ash. Cody slumped forward, his face buried in his hands, his body convulsing as he sobbed. I didn't. His words were no longer arguments. They were the broken cries of a man unraveling. Meri rose slowly, her voice quiet, but edged with a lifetime of buried pain. He never made me sign anything, she admitted, her tone trembling yet steady. But he didn't have to. He knew my loyalty would blind me. He took advantage of that loyalty. For years, I defended him, justified him, sacrificed for him. And for what? To see him destroy everything. That was my prison. And I let him lock me inside it. Her words cut deeper than any testimony. Cody raised his swollen, tear-streaked face toward her, his eyes a cocktail of regret and rage. The judge leaned forward, her tone grave. This court cannot ignore these testimonies. What has been described is not merely civil mismanagement. This shows a pattern of coercion, manipulation, and abuse of trust. Combined with evidence of financial fraud, forgery, and obstruction, this case may proceed toward criminal prosecution. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously. The courtroom thrummed with incredulity. Cody's voice cracked through the noise. "You can't do this to me. I was protecting us. Everything I did was for the family." Christine spun toward him, her tears falling freely. "No, Cody, everything you did was for you, okay? And now the family you claim you protected is the one tearing you down.
But we're already a week and a half in. I don't think it's going to miraculously resolve itself in the next 4 or 5 days. So it's going to be longer than 2 weeks.
The final day of the trial did not so much dawn as it descended upon Flagstaff like a storm that had been waiting for years to break. The heavens themselves, bruised and swollen with iron-gray clouds, their edges seething with the weight of judgment. Rain threaded down in sharp, merciless lines, slicing through the cold morning air as though nature had grown impatient, demanding resolution, demanding truth. The courthouse steps gleamed slick beneath that rain, stone glistening under the flash of waiting cameras, every droplet striking like the impatient tick of a clock counting down the last seconds of a dynasty. Reporters huddled in clusters beneath umbrellas. Whispers carried intense currents. Cameras trained upon the great oak doors, ready to capture the instant history would fracture. Inside, the very corridors of justice seemed to vibrate with expectation. The echo of security boots on polished marble sounding like the steady beat of war drums. The courtroom itself sat hushed, a cavernous chamber filled with eyes wide and breaths shallow, as if even the air had been chained in anticipation. Christine, Janelle, and Meri sat together in the front row, shoulder to shoulder. Not just women, but warriors forged by years of betrayal and grief, their faces drawn and pale, yet alight with a fragile, unyielding flame. They were scarred, each of them carrying wounds that could never fully heal, but in that moment they shone with defiance, their unity a rebuke to every word, every lie, every silence that had tried to separate them. Beside them sat the specter of what had once been. Loyalty, Robin, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights, her fingers trembling around a tissue already shredded by grief. Once she had been Cody's shield, the wall that bore the contempt of the other wives. The one who stood by him even when all others faltered. But now she sat apart, smaller, broken, her silence collapsing into guilt, her loyalty transfigured into ruin. And then came Kody Brown. Once the patriarch, once the man whose voice thundered over a household, whose gaze commanded obedience, whose presence filled rooms like a storm cloud. But on this day, he was no storm, no thunder, only the husk left. Behind, shackled at wrists and ankles, he shuffled forward, every clink of the chains a cruel echo of what he had built and destroyed. The man who once strutted with pride now hunched like a shadow. Pale and hollow-eyed, his lips moving in inaudible murmurs. Prayer, curse, denial, only he knew. His shoulders sagged beneath the invisible weight of a broken empire. When the bailiff seated him at the defense table, his hands clawed at the polished wood as though clinging to the last edge of power, desperate to hold on to a world already sliding away. The scrape of iron against oak was not just sound. It was an accusation, a lament, a dirge for all he had squandered. The chamber rose as Judge Harrison entered, her robe flowing like a tide of judgment, her gavel striking down with a force that cracked the air like thunder cleaving stone. Silence fell, heavier than before, a silence so deep it pressed upon lungs. A silence that seemed to know it was bearing witness to the end of something monumental. Her voice rang out, steady, deliberate, unyielding. This case has not uncovered simple errors, nor mere mismanagement. What we have seen here is a web of deceit, coercion, betrayal, sham signatures, hidden accounts, the silencing of wives, the neglect of children, all masked beneath the guise of family and faith. Every word struck like a hammer blow, and the walls themselves seemed to tighten, as if the building of justice strained to contain the weight of what was spoken. Christine's testimony was recalled, her voice breaking yet resolute as she told of promises twisted into lies, of land sold in secrecy, of a family's dreams bartered away. Documents backed her words with an authority that could not be denied. Janelle's voice echoed in memory, her fury sharpened into iron, presenting the bank records. Irrefutable proof of $75,000 siphoned away into Cody's personal accounts. Each page had been a knife, each number a betrayal etched in ink. Meri's words lingered too, quiet but edged with ice, admitting how her loyalty had been weaponized, how her silence had been twisted into a prison that had bound her for years. And then Robin, once the unshakable defender, trembling under oath, her voice shattering like glass as she admitted what she had seen, what she had concealed, her silence collapsing into confession. In that moment, the last stone of Cody's defense crumbled, the final wall giving way. The judge's gaze turned sharp, piercing Cody as though she could strip away every last excuse, every last denial, cutting into his marrow with the truth he had long buried. "You were entrusted with authority," she declared, her words cold as steel. "You called yourself husband, father, patriarch, yet you betrayed that sacred trust. You did not build unity. You built only your own destruction." The words rang like a tolling bell. Gasps rippled through the gallery, pens scratched furiously. Cameras flared in bursts of white fire, and sketch artists' hands shook as they etched the face of a man unraveled. Christine sobbed openly, relief and sorrow colliding. Janelle's jaw set, her vindication edged with grief. Meri's chin quivered, but her eyes blazed cold resolve. And Robin dissolved entirely, her apologies spilling like ghosts too late to save. Cody erupted, his voice breaking into desperation. "I carried you all. I built everything. You would be nothing without me." Once, those words would have thundered with command. But now they echoed like madness, the ravings of a man drowning beneath truth. The gavel crashed down, drowning him in silence. Then came the final decree, each syllable carved into history. The Flagstaff properties restored to Christine, Janelle, and Meri. Restitution of $750,000 demanded with penalties. And Kody Brown, referred to criminal prosecution on charges of fraud, coercion, and obstruction of justice. The gavel struck again, a gunshot, a tomb ceiling, the sound of an empire collapsing. Christine collapsed into Janelle's arms, her tears those of grief and unbearable liberation. Janelle held her close, her eyes brimming but her face proud, with long-sought vindication. Meri sat stiff, her tears falling quietly, her silence a crown of steel. Robin folded in on herself, her sobs damning her more than any judge could. And Cody. Cody sat frozen, pale, his mouth open but no words emerging. A king dethroned, a patriarch shattered, his empire stripped, his family reclaimed by truth. When the doors opened to the storm outside, the wives emerged first. Christine, Janelle, and Meri walked together, heads high, faces pale but luminous with resolve. Cameras flared, microphones surged forward, and in the rain, Christine's voice broke through. This was never revenge. This was truth for our children. Janelle's words followed, steady as steel. Silence makes betrayal stronger. We speak now, so no one else has to endure what we did. Meri's words cut clean and cold. Justice was served. The crowd roared, reporters surged, flashes lit the storm, but none of it dimmed the sight of their unity reborn. Robin trailed behind, sobbing openly, her silence now an open confession, the weight of her tears speaking louder than denial ever had. And then, last of all, Cody emerged, dragged in chains. The rain poured upon him, cameras blazed, jeers rose. From the crowd, his shoulders hunched, his jaw clenched, his face drained of color. The final photograph captured him there, alone upon the courthouse steps, ghostly beneath the storm, a patriarch without a family. A man without a kingdom, his empire reduced to ash. It was not merely the end of a trial, it was the collapse of a dynasty, the burial of an illusion, the fall of a man who once ruled his world with silence and power, undone at last by the truth that refused to stay buried. For deeper sagas of downfall and truth revealed, stay with Starspill USA, where the stories the world tries to hide are brought fully into the light.